Yes, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I first would like to thank again this wonderful artist for the presentation. And then I would like to thank you for the invitation to think about the future cities here in this fabulous environment, a real thinking space and reflection space. So let me start my presentation by paraphrasing the first sentence of the book of Lewis Mumford on the City of History. At the beginning of civilization, we find the city that was symbolically a world. And today we are confronted with a civilization, with a world that has become, in many practical aspects, a city. So, discussion about the city, we're spanning the whole span of civilization, and it's evident cities are continuously changing. And I have to confess, in contrary to Rousseau, I do not detest cities, I love cities. I feel myself as an urban man. Maybe this may give my lecture also a little bit something normative, but I think the future will be the city and our future will be shaped in the cities. So, cities are probably humankind's most complex creations, never finished, constantly changing. They are manifestations of history and culture, incubators of innovation and creativity, but also arenas of political, cultural, and social struggles. They are built, sometimes destroyed, not only by earthquakes, but by man. They are rebuilt, transformed, occupied by different groups and used for different functions. And do not forget, cities are not just brick and mortar, not only glass, concrete, steel, and tarmac. From their beginning, they symbolize the dreams of societies. Sometimes dreams which are not so lucky, but sometimes dreams which really give way to the future. They are spaces of hope, spaces of opportunity, and cities are open systems, open for foreigners, for new ideas, new aesthetical forms, and new developments. And cities incorporate diversity and heterogeneity. So I just started with these very general characteristics of the city. For when I am talking later on the empirical developments, I am forced to refer to a very statistical definition of cities, which just are defined by size. And it's always good to keep in mind these characteristics which really are the nature of cities. It's very often told the 21st century is a century of the city, and I have to make a compliment to President Duke. He is one of the very few people who quoted correctly the UN Habitat, not saying that the majority of the world is now living in cities. He said the majority of the world is now living in urban centers. So I think I will come back to this distinction, which is from quite some importance. Also, for opening up the discussion, I will quote Doug Sanders, who says, I quote, "What will be remembered about the 21st century more than anything else, except perhaps the effects of changing climate, is a great and final shift of human population out of the rural agricultural life into cities. We will end this century as a wholly urban space." So this shows the enormous challenges we will be faced. It's open which forms this urban world will have. It's up also to us, as in this conference are very competent colleagues talking about technology and all the possibilities they give. I will focus mainly on the social and social-economic problems. So let me start with a look on the urban landscape. We see here 1960, the percentage of urban, and we see the cities. So the city, the urbanization is actually focused on Europe and North America. There are only 2 cities bigger than 10 million inhabitants. This is New York and this is Tokyo. And we see the predominantly rural part of the world. And, but already big shifts. Here we have some artifacts, or not artifacts, but in a continent with very low density of population. Of course, the urbanization is already very high in the 1960s. When we now have a look to today, we see a completely shift of the landscape. We see the shift from Europe and America to Latin America, and especially to Asia and Africa. And now I don't want to count the cities above 10 million. So you see they're mainly concentrated here in this field. And we see that in a good part of the world, we have already more than 75% of the people living in urban centers or more or less cities. And in the future, 2025, we will see that this shift will go on, and actually every region of the world will be predominantly urban. So this is, I think, a very important challenge. And we have to see that the gravity of urban landscape is moving south and east. It is estimated that more than 90% of future urban population growth will occur in the cities of Asia and Africa. Asia and Africa have already 3/4 of the world's 100 fastest growing large cities. With the growth of the urban population in the developing world of 3 million people per week, it seems likely the urban future does not lie in Europe or North American cities. That will not mean that we have to forget our cities. We have enormous challenges to transform them. But we have to be aware that things are happening elsewhere, especially in the southern hemisphere. But when talking about the century of city and the problems of urbanization, we have quite some conceptual problems and problems of definition. First, urbanization and difference with urban growth. Urbanization means the shift from the rural to the urban. That means the transformation of our ways of living. And urban growth means the growth in the city. So very often this is confused. And I think it is important to understand the conflicts we have in our cities. That very often we talk about urban growth, and sometimes we talk about urbanization. But I will come back to this. And the second, I have already mentioned the differentiation between urban centers and cities. All the data we have, which I have presented you, are based on the UN Population Division, on the basis of the national government census. And there we have a big confusion, that some of them define the urban centers with 2,500 and more, some with 5,000, some with 15,000. And if, for instance, China would choose a definition like the Latin American, you would see the part of China already be more than 75% urbanized. So what we see are artifacts. But the most important thing is not the state, but the process and the dynamics of transformation. And from this, so coming to another popular means of the discussion. In the discussion, when we discuss and when we see a film about urbanization, it's a megacity. It's always a megacity. The whole focus, if there is a conference, it's on megacities. If there's a new network, it's on megacities. So we think megacities, everything is happening there, and they are growing and growing, now 10 million, soon 20 million. But the truth is, the most dynamic of urban development is not in the megacities. It is in the second-tier cities. in the medium-sized cities. And this is very important, for this has enormous political impacts. We concentrate there where already the discussion is. And we need new instruments, new plannings, new expertise for the second-tier cities. For there, things are happening. So it's very important to be aware that this is a big problem. And also the point of view of the economic performance of the megacities, it's actually declining. There are people moving out, and in fact, these huge metropolises are already growing more slowly than the economy of their host cities. The second, for me, very important thing, economic success need not imply ever larger cities. So we have this obsession of hierarchies of global cities. Oh, cities are only successful if they are global cities. But when we look, maybe this is very subjective, but if we look at the very performative and social inclusive cities, we see city systems, for instance, in Europe. So there is not a necessary context between the size of cities and the economic success. We have to overcome this obsession of hierarchies, obsession of looking only on the big cities. The future will be a networked urban configuration with multipolar, developing dynamic. So this is a very important point. So rural-urban migration and natural growth. The third meat which produced, and it's right, we are looking on the rural-urban migration. This is a sender, and this is producing a lot of problem. But when we are looking on the urban growth, in spite of the importance of the rural-urban migration, most urban growth today stems from natural increase of urban population. Why is this so important? Many policymakers try to prevent urban growth by discouraging rural-urban migration with tactics such as evicting squatters, denying them services. And this is extremely not only unhuman, it's also counterproductive. So advances in social development, making education universally available, literacy, and enable women to avoid the unwanted fertility and reduce the main factor of urban growth, the natural increase. So we have to rethink about our strategies, and this is actually one of the key lessons when we look on cities. Sustainability only will be successful together with equity, and equity only will be successful with empowerment strategies and giving the people a chance, developing the cities and cities of hope. So now we're coming to one of my key points, the urbanization of poverty. Until recently, the rural settlements were the epicenters of poverty. And this is now changing. Why? As we have seen that the urbanization dynamics are shifting to the south, we also confronted with a change of the prime drivers of urbanization. Till now, the urbanization mainly was pushed forward by economic growth, but especially in some countries, in most countries of Africa, we see a demographic-driven urbanization process, a process driven by poverty, a poverty-driven process. This means that we have the phenomenon of an urbanization of poverty. And linked with this urbanization of poverty, we have the expansion of the slums. Many of the new poor urbanites will live in informal settlements or slums and will suffer from overcrowding and environmental degradation. You all know the ciphers. In this report of the UN Habitat 2001, they quoted that about 1 billion people are living in slums. That is about 1/3 of the world's population. And UN Habitat projected that in the next 30 centuries, the global number of slums dwellers will increase to about 2 billion if no firm and concrete actions is taken. In the meantime, happily, there's action taken. Over the last 10 years, the proportion of urban population living in slums has declined. But in absolute terms, the number have actually grown considerably and will continue to rise. And I believe this is a crucial challenge for the future. If we succeed to transform these slums in spaces of hope, or if they will fall into spaces of despair. Slums as poverty trap or as transition space. So we have these two discourses. On the one hand, as we have seen with Mike Davis, The Splendor of Slums, and the other discourse, Saunders with the Arrival Cities. For Saunders, he labels this transition space, others label as slums, others label as informal settlements. He labels them as arrival cities. And he sees for the arrival cities that they can function as key instruments in creating a new middle class, abolishing the horrors of rural poverty and ending inequality. So our big choice is, if we create conditions that this transition will take place and there will be this abolishing of horror of the rural poverty, or we create a new urban misery which can really take very explosive forms. These transition spaces, arrival cities, are the places where the next great economic and cultural boom will be born, or where the next great explosion of violence will occur. The difference depends on our ability to notice and our willingness to engage. And we all know these explosions of violence are not only in the south. We are now confronted with the situation, for instance, with this wonderful city, Marseille, where the vice mayor is asking for the army to fight this violence breaking up, where the people in their despair, instead of being integrated in a gainful employment, buy a Kalashnikov and try to make their living in this urban jungle. So what we have heard from Brecht is always recoming in the same question, and it's our question how we can transform this development. So the challenge is in learning how to exploit the possibilities of urbanization. And talking about urban, we should not forget the rural. I think I'm very glad that Stephen will formulate this context so I can make it very sure. In this transformation process, we need a new articulation, rural-urban linkages. With the urbanization of poverty and rising unemployment, food security has become a major concern in most cities of the developing world. Urban agriculture is increasingly practiced by the poor to supplement declining income and to mitigate food and income insecurity. The shaping of the rural-urban linkages have to be placed high on the agenda, and we have to reformulate our concept of cities. And when we're talking about the whole world will become a city, it's this question in the middle, how we shape these interlinkages, but this I will come later. So one last comment to this question, rural and urban poverty. Very often, the city is accused for this urban poverty, but it's not the city. It's the conditions the people are living on, we are creating on our globe. Urban poverty rates are overall lower than those in rural areas. So the poverty of the rural pushing the people out to these possible spaces of hope. The migration of population from rural to urban areas actually helps to reduce national poverty rates. Poverty has been reduced and inequality has declined with urbanization in those countries that allow the arrival cities to flourish. Many of the urban poor are not rural-urban migrants, but poor displaced from other parts of the city. So, like these people. By displacing the people, it's not just displacing them, it's a destruction of the social capital they have built up, it's their access to the labor market, it's access to the networks, it's their microeconomy they have developed, and they are pushed out to the periphery and are falling in the poverty trap, for they are no longer linked to the fabric of the urban. And of course, we have terrible situations at the periphery. This is the Manila on the garbage dump. But we also have very different forms where we have, I showed this picture to show when we're talking about these informal settlements or slums. It's not just a living space, it's a working space, primarily a space to make their livelihood. And here we see the city as a way to survive informal settlements, informal economy. This is Dharavi, one of the most important economic clusters in Mumbai, integrated in the world market with a very developed economic processes on all different forms. Here, with all this recycling industry of Dharavi, the Indian industry really would get in big troubles. So this is Mercato of Addis Ababa, we will talk later. That's the economic backbone of the city. About 3/4 of the production is concentrated there. And of course, when we're talking about informal settlements and slums, we always have this picture, everybody of you know it, this urban divide. The gated community on the right, on the left, the slum. But these pictures also can mislead our discussion and thinking. So when you dare to go inside, you see a completely different situation. You see urbanity in the slum, and you see the disaster of a gated community with an armed doorman and with television surveillance and with anxious people, terrified by their richness. And here you see people developing their social capital, transforming their city. They even succeeded to get a public transport system. And in the meantime, you have inside of Parisopolis a flourishing real estate market, which means the people have transferred to a middle class, and they are now entering in the city in a completely different sector. So this would be one example how this arrival city can be a success, but we should not forget by this development, with real estate markets, also the thresholds coming in are getting higher, and there will be new urban informal settlements. Talking about urban poverty, we should not forget that in this urbanization process, we also have a rise of a new middle class. So this is a prognosis for the next 25 years, that the new middle class with an annual income of $20,000 per household, it's mainly in the emerging countries and mainly in the second-tier city. So this will be an enormous transformation. So this reflects a successful integration, but it confronts us with the next problem, and a problem which is in the center of our discussion, the question of climate change and how we can adapt our cities. So it's obvious, this outdated form of modernity, this fossil urbanism, shows that we would need several additional Earths to allow all humanity to live in suburban houses with 2 cars and a lawn. So this cannot be a general model. However, we should not forget that everybody wants to arrive there. So this is a big question, how we transform our cities. So till now, the formal urbanization patterns expanding all over the world are still highly fossil dependent, with high impact on global warming and climate change. The effects of urbanization and climate change are converging and threatening the world's environmental, economic, and social stability. And it's clear, everybody knows, half of the world living in cities, generating about 80% of global GDP on 3% of the Earth's land area, but with an enormous ecological footprint. We consume 50% of the energy, produce 80% of waste, and the cities are directly responsible for more than 60% of the greenhouse gas emission. However, and this is important, it is not urban concentration, but unsustainable patterns of production and consumption. It's the same question with the poverty. It's not the city, but it's the way we have organized our civilization. So, and also to make an important difference, cities in poor countries most environmental problems are local and mostly concern health, such as inadequate water and sanitation, poor air quality, lacking waste disposal. In more affluent cities in the north, local and regional impacts have usually declined through environmental regulation, investment in waste treatment and pollution control, and the outsourcing of manufacturing. We outsource our problems. But these affluent cities have a strong impact on global warming and global climate change. The climate change will make particularly the poorest and most marginalized increasingly vulnerable to floods, landslips, extreme weather events, and other natural disasters. So we have enormous disparity of the impacts, of the causes and impacts of climate change on the globe. I know many of the presentations will be on sustainability and technology, so only just one short, maybe problematic critique on the modern city. It's not modern architecture. It's a way how we transform our society. It's a strategy where, in the Western discourse, a modern city is conceived as an effective machine, as an active engine, offering the emancipation from the constraints of nature. That's our basic idea of the city. The modern city frees the urbanites from cultivating the food, helps them to overcome the constraints of space and time, of day and night, offers affluent energy and water without concern about waste and emission. In this vision of modernity, the city frees the urbanites from physical work and accountability. It cuts them off of accountability. But these cities became veritable entropy engines with an ever-expanding ecological footprint. This urban way of life is not only damaging the ecosystem, but also questioning the survival of humanity. You have wonderful pictures of the future cities in your catalog. It's interesting to look back 100 years. What was the vision? 100 years ago, 80 years ago, the future city, that was the engine for the annihilation of space, the compression of time and space. The vertical city, actually mainly a transportation system. And actually, I think it's a great success that today we rediscover our cities as living spaces. But that's not enough. We have to reintegration to bring back production to our cities. We have to produce the energy we need in our cities. And we have to try to reintegrate agriculture in forms of urban agriculturing, as building integrated agriculture in our cities. So our ways of modernization, our production of regimes and modes of consumption have eroded the resilience not only in many natural systems, but also in many social and economic systems. Europe invented modernity, this way of modernity we are confronted today. Therefore, we have a special responsibility to contribute to a reshaping of modernity at a global level to find ways to reconcile our production regimes, our mode of consumptions, and our forms of civilization with nature. The challenge is in learning how to use the creativity of people, new technologies, and the possibilities of urbanization with this big task. Will the whole world become a city? There's a high possibility that in this century, the whole world will become a city. But this will not be a big city. This will be a very complex configurations of cities, integrating villages, and hopefully productive forms of interchange between the countries, the rural and the urban. There will be the rise of a new configuration in which the rural will be integrated. Maybe we can call it an urban archipelagos. The future cities will have many phases and a high diversity of forms. There is no longer the future city as a manifestation of the most advanced technology and urban modernity, which will serve as a model to follow. In the coming transition processes, it will be crucial to open up new opportunities for imagining the distinctive futures of all cities and towns, and to use the creativity of their inhabitants to develop an equitable, sustainable, and resilient urban future. Thank you.